My name is Polly Kaufman, and I teach in the history department and the honors program. And we're going to talk about Rachel Carson today. I have two students who are going to be reading some of the things that she's written. A lot has been made of the fact that Silent Spring was published 50 years ago. But we're going to talk about the early part of her life because she was especially interested in the ocean. She was a marine biologist. She worked for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries and then for the Fish and Wildlife Service. She lived on Southport Island near Booth Bay Harbor, a cottage that she built herself in 1953. And she wrote 4 books about the sea. The first one was Under the Sea Wind, published in 1941. The second one was The Sea Around Us, that was published in 1951 and was a great big success. And then she wrote my favorite, The Edge of the Sea, in 1955. So I have two people who are going to read today. I guess we'll start with Rachel. She's going to read 2 of the things that were written about the sea, and you have to come up here.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Can everyone hear? More or less. All right. We'll start with The Edge of the Sea by Rachel Carson. The shore is an ancient world. For as long as there has been an earth and sea, there has been this place of the meeting of land and water. Yet it is a world that keeps alive the sense of continuing creation and of the relentless drive of life. Each time that I enter it, I gain some new awareness of its beauty and its deeper meanings, sensing that intricate fabric of life by which one creature is linked with another, and each with its surroundings. In my thoughts of the shore, one place stands apart for its revelation of exquisite beauty. It is a pool hidden within a cave that one can visit only rarely and briefly when the lowest of the year's low tides fall below it. And perhaps from that very fact it acquires some of its special beauty. Choosing such a tide, I hoped for a glimpse of the pool. The ebb was to fall early in the morning. I knew that if the wind held from the northwest and no interfering swell ran in from a distant storm, the level of the sea should drop below the entrance to the pool. There had been sudden ominous showers in the night, with rain like handfuls of gravel flung on the roof. When I looked out into the early morning, the sky was full of a gray dawn light, but the sun had not yet risen. Water and air were paling. Across the bay, the moon was a luminous disk in the western sky, suspended above the dim line of distant shore. The full August moon, drawing the tide to the low levels of the threshold of the alien sea world. As I watched, a gull flew by above the spruces. Its breast was rosy with the light of the unrisen sun. The day was, after all, to be fair. Later, as I stood above the tide near the entrance to the pool, the promise of that rosy light was sustained. From the base of that steep wall of rock on which I stood, a moss-covered ledge jutted seaward into deep water. In the surge at the rim of the ledge, the dark fronds of oarweed swayed, smooth and gleaming as leather. The projecting ledge was the path to the small hidden cave in its pool. Occasionally a swell, stronger than the rest, rolled smoothly over the rim and broke in foam against the cliff. But the intervals between such swells were long enough to admit me to the ledge, and long enough for a glimpse of that fairy pool, so seldom and so briefly exposed. And so I knelt on the wet carpet of sea moss and looked back into the dark cavern that held the pool in a shallow basin. The floor of the cave was only a few inches below the roof, and a mirror had been created in which all that grew on the ceiling was reflected in the still water below. Under water that was clear as glass, the pool was carpeted with green sponge. Gray patches of sea squirts glistened on the ceiling, and colonies of soft coral were a pale apricot color. In the moment when I looked into the cave, a little elfin starfish hung down, suspended by a merest thread, perhaps by only a single tube foot. It reached down to touch its own reflection, so perfectly delineated that there might have been not one starfish, but two. The beauty of the reflected images and of the limpid pool itself was the poignant beauty of things that are ephemeral, existing only until the sea should return to fill the little cave. When I go down into this magical zone of the low water of the spring tides, I look for the most delicately beautiful of all the shore's inhabitants. Flowers that are not plant but animal, blooming on the threshold of the deeper sea. In that fairy cave, I was not disappointed. Hanging from its roof were the pendant flowers of the hydroid tubularia, pale pink, fringed and delicate as the wind flower. Here were creatures so exquisitely fashioned that they seemed unreal, their beauty too fragile to exist in a world of crushing force. Yet every detail was functionally useful, every straw and hydrant and petal-like tentacle fashioned for dealing with the realities of existence. I knew that they were merely waiting, in that moment of the tide's ebbing, for the return of the sea. Then, in the rush of the water, in the surge of the surf, and the pressure of the incoming tide, the delicate flower heads would stir with life. They would sway on their slender stalks, and their tentacles would sweep the returning water, finding in it all that they needed for life. And so in that enchanted place on the threshold of the sea, the realities that possessed my mind were far from those of the land world I had left an hour before. In a different way, the same sense of remoteness and of a world apart came to me in a twilight hour on a great beach on the coast of Georgia. I had come down after sunset and walked far out over sands that lay wet and gleaming, to the very edge of the retreating sea. Looking back across that immense flat, crossed by winding water-filled gullies, and here and there holding shallow pools left by the tide, I was filled with awareness that this intertidal area, although abandoned briefly and rhythmically by the sea, is always reclaimed by the rising tide. There at the edge of low water, the beach with its reminders of the land seemed far away. The only sounds that were those of the wind and the sea and the birds. There was one sound of wind moving over water, and another of water sliding over the sand and tumbling down the faces of its own waveforms. The flats were astir with birds, and the voice of the willet rang insistently. One of them stood at the edge of the water and gave its loud, urging cry. An answer came from far up the beach, and the two birds flew to join each other. The flats took on a mysterious quality as dusk approached, and the last evening light was reflected from the scattered pools and creeks. Then birds became only dark shadows, with no color discernible. Sanderlings scurried across the beach like little ghosts, and here and there the darker forms of the willet stood out. Often I could come very close to them before they would start up in alarm, the sanderlings running away, the willets flying up, crying. Black skimmers flew along the ocean's edge, silhouetted against the dull metallic gleam, where they went flitting above the sand like large, dimly seen moths. Sometimes they skimmed to the winding creeks of tidal water, where little spreading surface ripples marked the presence of small fish. The shore at night is a different world, in which the very darkness that hides the distractions of daylight brings into sharper focus the elemental realities. Once exploring the night beach, I surprised a small ghost crab in the searching beam of my torch. He was lying in a pit he had dug just above the surf, as though watching the sea and waiting. The blackness of the night possessed water, air, and beach. It was the darkness of an older world, before man. There was no sound, but the all-enveloping, permeable sounds of wind blowing over water and sand, and of waves crashing on the beach. There was no other visible life, just one small crab near the sea. I have seen hundreds of ghost crabs in other settings, but suddenly I was filled with the odd sensation that the first time I knew the creature in its own world, that I understood as never before the essence of its being. In the moment, time was suspended. The world to which I belonged did not exist, and I might have had an onlooker from outer space. The little crab alone with the sea became a symbol that stood for life itself, for the delicate, destructible, yet incredibly vital force that somehow holds its place amid the harsh realities of the inorganic world. And the second part of this reading will be The Enduring Sea by Rachel Carson. Now I hear the sea sounds about me. The night high tide is rising, swirling with a confused rush of waters against the rocks below my study window. Fog has come into the bay from the open sea, and it lies over water and over the land's edge, seeping back into the spruces and stealing softly among the juniper and the bayberry. The rested waters, the cold wet breath of the fog, are of a world in which man is an uneasy trespasser. He punctuates the night with the complaining groan and grunt of a foghorn, sensing the power and menace of the sea. Hearing the rising tide, I think how it is pressing also against other shores I know, rising on a southern beach where there is no fog, but a moon edging all the waves with silver and touching the wet sands with lambent sheen. And on a still more distant shore, sending its streaming currents against the moonlit pinnacles and the dark caves of the coral rock. Then in my thoughts, these shores, so different in their nature and in the inhabitants they support, are made one by the unifying touch of the sea. For the differences I sense in this particular instant of time that is mine are but the differences of a moment, determined by our place in the stream of time and in the long rhythms of the sea. Once this rocky coast beneath me was a plain of sand. Then the sea rose and found a new shoreline. And again, in some shadowy future, the surf will have ground these rocks to sand and will have returned the coast to its earlier state. And so in my mind's eye, these coastal forms merge and blend in a shifting, kaleidoscopic pattern in which there is no finality, no ultimate fixed reality, earth becoming fluid as the sea itself. On all these shores, there are echoes of past and future, of the flow of time, obliterating yet containing all that has gone before, of the sea's eternal rhythms, the tides, the beat of surf, the pressing rivers of the currents, shaping, changing, dominating of the stream of life, flowing as inexorably as any ocean current from past to unknown future. For as the shore configuration changes in the flow of time, the pattern of life changes, never static, never quite the same from year to year. Whenever the sea builds a new coast, waves of living creatures surge against it, seeking a foothold, establishing their colonies. And so we come to perceive life as a force as tangible as any of the physical realities of the sea, a force strong and purposeful, as incapable of being crushed or diverted from its ends as the rising tide. Contemplating the teeming life of the shore, we have an uneasy sense of the communication of some universal truth that lies just beyond our grasp. What is the message signaled by the hordes of diatoms flashing their microscopic lights in the night sea? What truth is expressed by the legions of the barnacles whitening the rocks with their habitations? Each small creature within finding the necessities of its existence in the sweep of surf. And what is the meaning of so tiny a being as the transparent wisp of protoplasm that is the sea lace, existing for some reason inscrutable to us? A reason that demands its presence by the trillion amid the rocks and weeds of the shore. The meaning haunts and ever eludes us, and in its very pursuit, we approach the ultimate mystery of life itself.
Although man's record as a steward of the natural resources of the earth has been a discouraging one, there has long been a certain comfort in the belief that the sea, at least, was inviolate, beyond man's ability to change and to despoil. But this belief, unfortunately, has proved to be naive. In unlocking the secrets of the atom, modern man has found himself confronted with a frightening problem: what to do with the most dangerous materials that have ever existed in all the Earth's history, the byproducts of atomic fission. The stark problem that faces him is whether he can dispose of these lethal substances without rendering the Earth uninhabitable. No account of the sea today is complete unless it takes note of this ominous problem. By its very vastness and its seeming remoteness, the sea has invited the attention of those who have the problem of disposal, and with very little discussion and almost no public notice. At least until the late 50s, the sea has been selected as a natural burying place for the contaminated rubbish and other low-level wastes of the atomic age. These wastes are placed in barrels lined with concrete and hauled out to sea, where they are dumped overboard at previously designated sites. Some have been taken out 100 miles or more. Recently, sites only 20 miles offshore have been suggested. In theory, the containers are deposited at depths of about 1,000 fathoms. But in practice, they have at times been placed in much shallower waters. Supposedly, the containers have a life of at least 10 years, after which whatever radioactive materials remain will be released to the sea. But again, this is only in theory. And a representative of the Atomic Energy Commission, which either dumps the waste or licenses others to do so, has publicly conceded that the containers are unlikely to maintain their integrity while sinking to the bottom. Indeed, in tests conducted in California, some have been found to rupture under pressure at only a few hundred fathoms. But it is only a matter of time until the contents of all such containers already deposited at sea will be free in the ocean waters, along with those yet to come as the applications of atomic science expand. To the packaged waste so deposited, there is now added the contaminated runoff from rivers that are serving as dumping grounds for atomic waste, and the fallout from the testing of bombs, the greater part of which comes to rest on the vast surface of the sea. The whole practice, despite protestations of safety by the regulatory agency, rests on the most insecure basis of fact. Oceanographers say they can make only vague estimates of the fate of radioactive elements introduced into the deep ocean. They declare that years of intensive study will be needed to provide understanding of what happens when such wastes are deposited in estuaries and coastal waters. As we have seen, all recent knowledge points to far greater activity at all levels of the sea than had ever been guessed at. The deep turbulence, the horizontal movements of vast rivers of ocean water streaming one above another in varying directions, the upwelling of water from the depths carrying with it minerals from the bottom, and the opposite downward sinking of great masses of surface water, all result in a gigantic mixing process that in time will bring about universal distribution of the radioactive contaminants. And yet, the actual transport of radioactive elements by the sea itself is only part of the problem. The concentration and distribution of radioisotopes by marine life may possibly have even greater importance from the standpoint of human hazard. It is known that plants and animals of the sea pick up and concentrate radiochemicals. But only vague information now exists as to the details of the process. The minute life of the sea depends for its existence on the minerals in the water. If the normal supply of these is low, the organisms will utilize instead the radioisotope of the needed element if it is present, sometimes concentrating it as much as 1,000,000 times beyond its abundance in seawater. What happens then to the careful calculation of a maximum permissible level? For the tiny organisms are eaten by larger ones and so on up the food chain to man. By such a process, tuna over an area of 1,000,000 square miles surrounding the Bikini Bomb test developed a degree of radioactivity enormously higher than that of the seawater. By their movements and migrations, marine creatures further upset the convenient theory that radioactive wastes remain in the area where they are deposited. The smaller organisms regularly make extensive vertical movements upward toward the surface of the sea at night, downward to great depths by day. And with them goes whatever radioactivity may be adhering to them, or may have become incorporated into their bodies. The larger fauna, like fishes, seals, and whales, may migrate over enormous distances, again aiding in spreading and distributing the radioactive elements deposited at sea. The problem then is far more complex and far more hazardous than has been admitted. Even in the comparatively short time since disposal began, research has shown that some of the assumptions on which it was based were dangerously inaccurate. The truth is that disposal has proceeded far more rapidly than our knowledge justifies. To dispose first and investigate later is an invitation to disaster, for once radioactive elements have been deposited at sea, they are irretrievable. The mistakes that are made now are made for all time. It is a curious situation that the sea, from which life first arose, should now be threatened by the activities of one form of that life. But the sea, though changed in a sinister way, will continue to exist. The threat is rather to life itself. And the next reading is from Mother Sea. Some of the island species have, at best, the most tenuous hold on life. The Laysan teal, found nowhere in the world but on one small island of Laysan, Even on this island, it occurs only on one end, where there is a seepage of fresh water. Probably the total population of this species does not exceed 50 individuals. Destruction of the small swampy bit of land that is its home, or the introduction of a hostile or competing species could easily snap the slender thread of life. Most of man's habitual tampering with nature's balance by introducing exotic species has been done in ignorance of the fatal chain of events that would follow. But in modern times, at least, we might profit by history. About the year 1513, the Portuguese introduced goats onto the recently discovered island of St. Helena, which had developed a magnificent forest of gumwood, ebony, and brazilwood. By 1560 or thereabout, the goats had so multiplied that they wandered over the island by the thousand, in flocks a mile long. They trampled the young trees and ate the seedlings. By this time, the colonists had begun to cut and burn the forest, so that it's hard to say whether man or goats were the more responsible for the destruction. But of the result, there was no doubt. By the early 1800s, the forests were gone, and the naturalist Alfred Wallace later described this once beautiful forest-clad volcanic island as a rocky desert, in which the remnants of the original flora persisted only in the most inaccessible peaks and crater ridges. When the astronomer Halley visited the islands of the Atlantic about 1700, he put a few goats ashore on South Trinidad. This time, without the further aid of man, the work of deforestation proceeded so rapidly that it was nearly completed within the century. Today, Trinidad slopes are the place of a ghost forest, strewn with the fallen and decaying trunks of long-dead trees. Its soft volcanic soils, no longer held by the interlacing roots, are sliding away into the sea. One of the most interesting of the Pacific islands was Laysan, a tiny scrap of soil which is a far outrider of the Hawaiian chain. It once supported a forest of sandalwood and fan-leaf palms and had 5 land birds, all peculiar to Laysan alone. One of them was the Laysan rail, a charming gnome-like creature no more than 6 inches high, with wings that seemed too small and were never used as wings, and feet that seemed too large and a voice like distant tinkling bells. About 1887, the captain of a visiting ship moved some of the rails to Midway, about 300 miles to the west, establishing a second colony. It seemed a fortunate move, for soon thereafter rabbits were introduced to Laysan. Within a quarter of a century, the rabbits had killed off the vegetation of the tiny island, reduced it to a sandy desert, and all but exterminated themselves. As for the rails, the devastation of their island was fatal, and the last rail died about 1924. Perhaps the Laysan colony could later have been restored from the Midway group had not tragedy struck there also. During the war in the Pacific, rats went ashore to island after island from ships and landing craft. They invaded Midway in 1943. The adult rails were slaughtered, the eggs were eaten, and the young birds killed. The world's last Laysan rail was seen in 1944. The tragedy of the oceanic islands lies in the uniqueness, the irreplaceability of the species they have developed by the slow processes of the ages. In a reasonable world, men would have treated these islands as precious possessions, as natural museums filled with beauty and curious works of creation, valuable beyond price because nowhere in the world are they duplicated. W.H. Hudson's lament for the birds of the Argentine pampas might even more truly have been spoken of the islands. The beautiful has vanished and returns not.